Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 29. We're going to be talking about the movie American Psycho from the year 2000. We'll be diving a little bit into Easton Ellis's book of the same title as well. Next episode, we are going to be covering black metal, the genre of music, and we are going to be having a special guest, Andy Connors, who former owner of Aquarius Records. He also works at Pandora, and he has a lot on his resume that makes him qualified to speak about black metal. Despite
his protestations to the contrary, he is an expert on the subject.
Absolutely.
Like, as if anyone is, he is.
Totally. And so, like how we expect our listeners to have seen the movie, read the book, seen the TV show that we talk about with black metal, which is this kind of, it's a huge, there are so many black metal bands and subgenres within the genre. I would say it's worth having a good cursory knowledge. Like, go to YouTube, if you're not already familiar with the genre, go to YouTube, do some listening, read the Wikipedia entry, get a good primer on the whole thing, and we can take you from there.
Yeah, judging by what I know of most of our audience, I have a feeling that a lot of people will be primed and ready for this particular episode.
Yeah, they'll be listening and getting ready to write us angry emails about details we got wrong.
Or bands that we liked without knowing anything about their history.
All right. Do you have some suggestions for our audience?
As always, if you have a few minutes and you haven't done it already, head over to iTunes and give us a 5-star rating or leave us a few kind words about our efforts. It's interesting, as I think the idea that reviews and ratings do things for you in some algorithmic capacity is way oversold. But I think it also does give you kind of like social proof. I've noticed as our ratings have gone up, more people sort of take the show more as a more credible source, and we've had more engagement lately as the number goes up. So please help us out. We are not rattling our Patreon 10 cup out there for donations or whatever, because that is uncool. And if you do it, sorry, but it's just not our thing. Just go on, rate and review. It's like giving us a high five.
And we also have a newsletter, which you can sign up for at scarythoughts.org. I love our newsletter. I take great pride in that thing.
Yeah, one of the features of it is we each pick 3 things that we're just kind of interested in that particular sequence in between episodes. And I'm always delighted to see what you've chosen and how different it is from what I have chosen.
Completely polar opposite views on how life could be better for our listeners.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, you should have seen American Psycho at this point. If you haven't, go watch it, come back. If you want to be extra geeky, go read the book, come back. They're both totally worth your time.
Yep.
So where do you want to start, Chad?
Well, if you haven't read it or seen the movie yet, it's interesting to me how the people who hate it the most have not engaged with it at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This movie came out when just after I graduated from high school, and this was right around when I don't know the real history of the etymology of the expression politically correct, but I probably first heard that expression in 1991. And that's when the book came out. And one thing that I think coats this entire episode is that the atmosphere that book came out in is very similar to the atmosphere we're in now. Mm-hmm. And the public outcry about that book is very similar to the type of reactionary ways that popular culture is navigating itself with knee-jerk political reactions we're having now.
Yeah, this book was dropped by Simon & Schuster, and we've seen that pretty recently, most famously with Milo Yiannopoulos' book. And it's interesting, no one ever seems to learn the lesson that when you ban something, it only comes back stronger. And so this book, Easton Ellis didn't even remark about its excellence at the time. He often just said, hey, I just thought this was going to be my 3rd book. And he always thought that Less Than Zero was the thing that had the most magic and was going to be his real legacy. But the controversy just set this book on fire at the time, and it became a really hot topic for a while. Really big names had commentary about it, and a lot of people didn't really engage the book on its merits. I mean, notable exception would be like Norman Mailer, who his review of it said, there's nothing really more odorous than like a person who has talent and goes for it but doesn't quite exceed it, which was like a really mean thing to say, I think, about the book at the time. But a lot of the criticism had to do with the idea that this was a book completely soaked in misogynistic violence. And It's there, but it's not exactly soaked in it.
No. Well, I mean, I'll concede that at the time this book came out, I would say probably all my friends boycotted the book.
You have terrible friends.
I think it was just sort of like in the air. That's a misogynist book. He's an awful person. Avoid it like the plague. It was right around, I think, the time of Cape Fear came out, and there was a lot of kind of outcry of misogyny in that film too. But that was Scorsese, right?
Yep.
Yeah, fuck that guy. Of course, what is ridiculous about the release of American Psycho and the reaction to it is these were reactions by people who had an agenda and mostly didn't read it or read just the most graphic parts. If you want to believe a book is a demonstration of misogynist violence, then you just read them the page that is the most violent against women and say that is what the book is, rather than that's maybe what the book is about. An examination of that, a critique of that. And the book and the movie are really incisive critiques of 80s overblown Reaganomic, post-Reaganomic capitalism, misogyny, patriarchy, all of it.
Yeah.
And Wall Street, and why the movie Wall Street, which was genuinely detrimental perhaps to the economy of America in the long run, which maybe we can touch on later.
Yeah.
It had real life effects on how fucked up this country became after it. This movie was a better critique of Wall Street.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, I guess now, because like Patrick Bateman's handsomeness, as portrayed by Christian Bale in the film, like I think that casting choice really did a lot to make the character of Patrick Bateman really appealing. And also the cinematography and the kind of what at the time was just barely retro quality, but is now fully retro quality of the film.
Yeah.
To me, it would be very difficult to honestly watch the film or read the movie and not pick up that it's criticizing the kind of person that Patrick Bateman is. I mean, you'd have to be really missing the boat. I mean, and although a lot of people do, I mean, people really glorify Patrick Bateman as a character in a weird way. Like, there's always somebody dressed up as Patrick Bateman for Halloween now with like, and if you haven't,
we love our violent killers. We love our movie killer icons. Right?
Yeah, for sure. And that was one of Bret Easton Ellis's really big criticisms at the time when Simon & Schuster dropped his book. He was like, hey, look, you guys are owned by Paramount, and Paramount has just put out 10 Friday the 13th movies that are just absolutely gruesomely violent. And it's like, why was this particular story so hated on? And part of it has to do with like the scenes that are violent are particularly violent.
Yeah. I think even though I've seen an awful lot of violence and read an awful lot of violence, I think the book American Psycho had, even though word count, there's not that much violence in it. I think it's like 4 pages total of is it 300 or 400 pages total are actual violence, but they're the most brutal, graphic, imaginative, but realistic depictions of violence I think I've ever come across. But what you were saying about people maybe celebrating Patrick Bateman really reminds me of, and if you can follow my train of thought here, reminds me of, how like biker outlaw culture that we still have is a fiction that was created by a couple of journalists who went to a rally in Hollister, California in the late 40s and kind of lied about what actually happened. And then that gave birth to The Wild One starring Marlon Brando. And then that just sort of like these biker gangs that actually existed. They were riding clubs and they were, bunch of no good nicks. But what we now think of as like biker gangs, Hells Angels, that sort of thing really exists because of these articles that were written that fabricated how evil these bikers actually were. It was just a bunch of guys drinking on the weekends and riding their bikes, and it turned into this this evil, this infection that America needed to lance. And I think that's really similar to, as brought up earlier, Wall Street, the movie, where Scorsese created this critique of the evils of hyperbolic capitalism and greed and the banking system. And for some reason, what stockbrokers were pre-movie Wall Street were nerdy pencil pushers. They were just like these bland, not interesting people making a lot of money. Post-movie Wall Street, it was life follows art, right? Stockbrokers became the thing that the movie depicted. The movie was making this critique, but it actually created that character. Gordon Gekko didn't exist in the real world, but it did after the movie came out because people saw this critique and and found it compelling enough to go and live as a lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean, definitely like what they did and the personalities existed, but the entire idea of what it meant to be a man living in that time, it was like you said, it's a fiction. Like in the way that bikers or being a biker, there's like an off-the-shelf biker culture now. And now there's like an off-the-shelf hipster biker cafe racer thing, you know, which is just weird. But the depiction of the violence being so realistic and the depiction of the clothing and the lifestyle being so realistic are, to me, very tied together by Easton Ellis' sources. You know, all the clothing descriptions, it was all based on GQ. So GQ was codifying this lifestyle, like, oh, this is what a man should drink, this is what a man should smoke, this is what a man should wear. And the violence was based on serial killer books, the like FBI, like crime scene books. And so he put these two things together. But when you read it, I think the best writing in the book isn't the violent scenes. I think it's the totally bizarre scenes where he just goes on these long tangents and basically these essays about things that Patrick Bateman is obsessed about. Like in the movie, the scene where he's talking about Huey Lewis in the news, like there are multiple chapters like that in the book, and there's one about Genesis, there's one about Whitney Houston, like just a whole chapter that is just a bio and a discography of those artists. Yeah, and Bret Easton Ellis is pretty clear that the thing that you're supposed to be horrified by is the vacuity of that obsession, and I think the film does a really good job of that. Totally, and I think one thing that I will say for our listeners who have seen the movie but not read the book that I think is kind of key to the difference is that almost anything that happens in the movie that is sort of like cringeworthy happens like 50 times in the book. So when you get these descriptions of someone's suit, or someone makes like a misogynist or homophobic or anti-Semitic comment, you get pages and pages and pages of that. In the movie, it just kind of happens once, but that's just like a macro view of the book taking great pains to immerse you in the details of these people's vacuity. Yeah, it's interesting too how Bret Easton Ellis uses anti-Semitism and homophobia in different ways in the story and things that Patrick Bateman says. Like in the film, the very first thing you really hear Patrick Bateman do is he checks his friend on his anti-Semitism in like the most social justice-y way imaginable. He just like stops him stone cold, and his friend Bryce is like, "Oh, you're the Boy Scout," or whatever he says to him. And then later on in the film, after Patrick Bateman has killed Paul Allen, maybe, and the detective is coming to investigate him, and he asks him about Paul Allen. He's like, "Well, he was part of that whole Yale thing." And the detective asks him, "Well, what do you mean by that?" He's like, "Well, he was a closet homosexual that did a bunch of cocaine." So it's weird how those things get used, and I think that clearly has something to do with Bret Easton Ellis being a gay man, like the way it's used in it. Oh, sure. Yeah. Something that comes up right at the top of the book, and I think is woven through the movie, is how manners function. Mm-hmm. That all of these characters are very uptight. They're very composed. They're very concerned with what is in, what is out. There is the idea of just wanting to fit in. Mm-hmm. But there's also a sort of overhanging condescension and rudeness. And the way manners play out in this
in the book and the movie, I think is really interesting because America has this tension with manners because, we tend to think of the origin of a lot of our manners come from England, which just like nailed what having good manners and good etiquette is. But manners and etiquette are also class-based, whether we like it or not. It's a matter of distinction. And it is something that the upper class can hold over the lower class. But it's also something that happened in history is that you could also have so much money that you didn't care about maintaining etiquette, that you could do whatever you wanted, that you didn't have to treat the help or other people with any sort of respect or equality or dignity. And I think that is deeply connected to violence. And this is something like Burroughs talks about, is maintaining good manners is really essential to preventing violence. That if everybody's capable of murder, if everybody's packing a weapon, manners is what keeps everybody from killing each other. It's the first step. You maintain a respect and a dignity between everybody, and that's what keeps us safe from each other.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. One thing, I'm reading Moby Dick right now, and it really makes me think of part of what Melville is talking about in that book is like on the whaling ship is just a bunch of madmen, just a bunch of crazy people out doing this crazy thing. And there is a type of manners that exists to keep the peace. And then there's also a type of manners that I think maybe would be more well described as etiquette, which is designed to separate you from the people who don't know. And in the early 80s, did you ever read the book, The Preppy Handbook?
My friend had it.
Okay, so
I skimmed it, yeah.
It's super fascinating because the idea was, like preppy and Wall Street, Gordon Gekko culture was at the time meant to be fairly aspirational. Like there would be all these people who would have a swatch and some Guess jeans or whatever, and you wanted to be clean and preppy. And that's part of what the early 80s mod revival was all about. It was all about having a nice haircut and these nice clothes, even though to look back on it now, everybody looks ridiculous. They look like clowns. But in the Preppy Handbook, the idea was that you can have all the clothes perfectly, but you also have to have the attitude. And part about the attitude was knowing about the etiquette. And then there's this interesting thing that kind of gets walked out in one of Tobias Wolff's books, Old School, which is about a prep school. The idea that you could be so part of that culture and so actually legitimate that you get to a point where you can have disdain for it. So the ultimate preppy look is like a really beat up pair of boat shoes, so it's not just about having the right things. It's about having the right disdain for the things too. And that's one of the things that you don't see from Patrick Bateman is there is no disdain for anything. It's absolute seriousness about all this stuff at all time because he's trying to be perfect.
Right. That reminds me of, I'm sure this will come up in our episode about black metal, but Dick Hebdich's groundbreaking cultural text, Subculture, The Meaning of Style, he really breaks out the history of with teddy boys and mods and rockers and things like that, where looking at the exact angle of your collar and how wide it is and how many buttons you have in your jacket and all these things as being deeply meaningful as symbols of rebellion. And it's funny to watch all of those codes that, like if you're a metal dude, if someone's a poser, if they just, you can tell by their hair, just so, if someone's just playing dress up on weekends, you can tell the real goth from the fake goth. How committed are they? And it's interesting to see these codes play themselves out at these in this high tax bracket, right? Like the Preppy Handbook, those codes have a meaning there too,
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the goth thing. I walked past on the way over here. I walked past a girl wearing this fucking New Rock boots, this big goofy goth boots. Someone's legit when they're wearing New Rock boots. It's just like they're so atrocious to that particular scene.
I want to. Real quick, you mentioned Moby Dick, and it's funny because one thing I didn't know about the book American Psycho before reading it is how he'll describe for 3 pages what everybody's wearing in the room, like in absolute detail, naming every designer, in painful, exhaustive detail. And I found that reading the book like that never yields. Like that just keeps, like every time he walks into a room, you have to get these exhaustive articulations of everybody's clothing. And I never finished Moby Dick, but I remember Moby Dick being very much like that, where you're getting like unbelievable amounts of detail that you may or may not care about, but it sets the stage. Is there a similarity there between the two?
I mean, I think the exhaustiveness is definitely felt. Like at a certain point, you're like, Jesus Christ. But I think it's doing two different things. In Moby Dick, it's painting an incredibly realistic world of, you know, Ishmael and the Pequod and I think that's how you pronounce the ship's name, and, you know, Ahab and Queequeg. The more I read of that book, even the stuff like, you know, there's like multiple chapters on cetacean history, which seem crazy. But as you read and read and read, the book and the environment becomes more realistic. Whereas I don't think that's quite what happens with this book. Like it feels like you're being cemented into this like consumer plastic lifestyle. It's almost like you're being sandblasted with it in the way that his friends are. And the film, it's a very different effect. The film, the costuming is perfect. It's very well done. It's like Mad Men level perfection. And when it came out in 2000, it had only been like 11 years. So it wasn't quite as retro fabulous as I hadn't seen it probably since it came out in theater. And I watched it again a couple days ago, and especially with things like Stranger Things being out and all this like early 80s obsession going on right now, it seems a lot more fun. Like even like Oliver People's glasses are kind of back again. You know, it like you go into like Warby Parker or something, like the type of glasses that Jared Leto and Christian Bale are wearing are very in right now. Although the two-tone color seems to have not survived the boss from Office Space. Yeah, and even mentioning Office Space, which we frequently do on this show, which is weird for a horror show. Office Space and American Psycho came out the same year. It came out in 2000, I believe. You know, and so the boss seems like a terrible holdover from that time. So there's a little bit of
God, same hair.
Same hair.
God.
It is basically like sort of like a weird Patrick Bateman character.
Holy shit.
You know, and even the position that he's having sex with the waitress in the main character's dream is sort of like a Patrick Bateman-y sort of like looking at the camera, like pointing out kind of deal. It's interesting. I don't know if that means anything or whatever, but the clothing is key to this whole thing. And what's weird too is I read a New York Times article that came out last year about this movie, and it, you know, it's about basically how many times Trump is mentioned in the book versus
a lot.
It's mentioned a lot, and I think it's really important. You know, there's a lot of like kind of retconning of, you know, is Trump like the Patrick Bateman character now? And Bret Easton Ellis is pretty clear. He's like, look, the Trump that Patrick Bateman was obsessed with in the early 80s, or the 90s rather, is very different than what our president is now. And he makes this point. He's like, look, if I had a last chapter where flash forward 20 years or 30 years and Patrick Bateman's wearing a MAGA hat ready to support Trump, it would be completely unbelievable.
Right.
You know, and one of the things he talks about is like if he wrote American Psycho now, he would probably be palling around with like Mark Zuckerberg and Silicon Valley types. And I ride a train into Silicon Valley every day to go, you know, I work in the content marketing salt mines, and you see a very similar thing going on as you do in the movie. Like people have the same shoes, the same weird glasses, the same techie backpacks. And it's interesting that people don't want to stand out a little bit more. And I don't know. And the characters who do stand out in the film are comical. Like there's a couple goths at dinner, and then, you know, some performance artist types.
Well, the only one who doesn't look like everybody else and get mistaken for everybody else is the gay character.
Yeah, the guy who's like the biggest doofus in the scene. Yeah.
Right. Well, funny you should mention Silicon Valley because, okay, talking about the 80s, I was a teenager in the 80s, and I got to be honest, my family was doing great. Like my perspective on the 80s is definitely colored by the fact that there was this economic boom and this ostentatiousness, and my family was part of that. I went from a small townhouse as a child to like a mansion in the East Bay, and went from like a concrete jungle in my childhood to this high school where kids drove BMWs and Porsches to the parking lot every day by the time I got to high school. And I was on the West Coast, so that was Silicon Valley. But it's kind of like my milieu was the West Coast version of what this film is critiquing about the East Coast. Because it really is like, there's Wall Street and there's Silicon Valley. And in the 80s, both of them had these crazy booms. And that's happening again now. Like everything that's happening on Wall Street, the economy collapsing and, you know, expanding and contracting, and the ways in which it is being dealt with and not being dealt with. And the same thing with West Coast, with Silicon Valley. And it's still kind of guided by this like implicit greed is good Gordon Gekko thing on the East Coast, whereas on the West Coast, it's more liberal. So that's absolutely happening, but it's kind of shaded, right? There's a different face put on the whole thing.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about in the context of that is in the film, Patrick Bateman is the only one of the yuppies who at all pretends to have social concerns, you know, and now that's essentially mandatory now. Like every company is like trying to do good in the world, or we're trying to make the world a better place for blah, 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 blah. And I find Patrick Bateman's friends in the film, like Bryce and Paul Allen, to be less egregious than he is because he's faking, you know? And then at the very end of the movie, his friend Bryce, they're all sitting around a table. Patrick Bateman has just had his breakdown and his crazy night out, and they're looking at the TV, and it's Ronald Reagan. And one of the guys says he puts on this act like he's like a sweet old man, but underneath, and then I think Patrick Bateman says, underneath doesn't matter. And it's kind of funny because basically what's happened in Patrick Bateman is what happens to super rich people. Given unlimited time and unlimited resources, you eventually become bored, right? And he laments when a character has like a slightly better version of the thing that he does. Like, for instance, the famous business card scene where he has a freak out because everybody has better business cards than him. So he's obsessing over these small details and they're causing him grief. But I think one of the reasons why he's driven into being a serial killer is he has this urge to want to be different. And it's a thing that he wants to do that kind of separates him from the rest of them.
Yeah, I mean, the way that is examined through music, I think, is really fascinating. That he loves, in the book, it's Genesis, Whitney Houston, Huey Lewis and the News. He's listening to Walking on Sunshine in the movie. He is listening to the most banal, the most sort of venerated. You know, he even says about Huey Lewis and the News, like, oh, shoot, was this in the... I didn't like them. I didn't like the early stuff.
Yeah,
because they sounded too black.
Well, no, in the film he says that they're a little too new wave for him.
That's it.
In the film, and then
he liked them when they got popular.
Yeah, he likes Four. Like that's the album that he thinks is their masterpiece. And you know, I'm not familiar with Huey Lewis at all, but I get the feeling that was like American Psycho, sort of a subversive album, like the whole like hip to be square thing. It's so obviously a put on. Like no one could possibly think that song was meant to be real except for the huge amount of people who took it for face value.
I don't know. I mean, it's sort of like the Born in the USA Springsteen thing. It's sort of that word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
Well, I think Bruce Springsteen, every single election cycle has to slap somebody down from using that song. It's like, hey, look, man, listen to these lyrics. Yeah. It is not American Pride anthem. You know, it's about pain.
But I think it's hard when you are at the scale, scope, and position of someone like Huey Lewis to make a goofy wackadoodle pop song that is somehow making fun of the thing that it is. When you're Huey Lewis and came out with that album Sports, and then your next album's got this like poppy, funny, fun song called Hip to Be Square, but it's not what you think it is, I don't think you're in the position to write good critical commentary in the mode that is not far enough away from the thing that you actually do. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But, saying that, it almost gives you a little bit of sympathy for the people who didn't take this film for what it was,
Yes.
you're like, okay, well, why did this fail to be obviously ironic to people? You're supposed to hate Patrick Bateman. You're supposed to think he's terrible. You're supposed to think that the reason why he does all these things is because he's engaged in this terrible type of male behavior that was at its height in the 80s. And yet still people sort of venerate it. And then, there's this whole idea of like the glamorous psychopath. And that type of character, I think, really came into its own in the 80s with your like Tony Montanas and even like hip hop culture, like NWA Straight Outta Compton is basically about a bunch of psychopaths doing crazy shit. And it's great, and part of you is like, oh man, this shit is so cool. And, like, I too want a 6'4" with the drop top. And it's kind of weird how this like late 80s transitioned from all these symbols of wealth and culture, but there's something really crazy about putting these symbols of wealth and culture into the hands of really, really bad people. Mm-hmm. There's something compelling about that. Like you see it. Like, I think the first time I ever really saw it was in Clockwork Orange. I think Alex from A Clockwork Orange has a lot of parallels with Patrick Bateman. They both traffic in this very specific language. Like, it's the language of fashion and upscale restaurants and food for Patrick Bateman, but, it's this invented, weird, quasi-articulate language for Alex. And they're both sort of obsessed with beauty, and they're both obviously obsessed with violence, and they both do it at another level above their friends. And speaking of the friends, you have to wonder a little bit, like all these characters in American Psycho are constantly mistaken for each other, and they're considered completely interchangeable. So are these other guys also participating in their own grotesque actions?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, you imagine probably, right? Because that's how one way to read the very ending of the film is like the lawyer who's like straight-faced. He's like, I just had dinner with Paul Allen. So what's going on there? Does he think he's had dinner with Paul Allen? Has Patrick Bateman killed someone he thinks is Paul Allen? Has no one been killed? Or is the entire scene full of a bunch of these bloodthirsty people who are just sort of covering for each other? And that's kind of...
Well, like the real estate agent is possibly covering... Maybe there were murders and it was a bloodbath, and it's more important for her to sell that fucking apartment than it is for her to find justice.
Yeah. I mean, then you think about it there, it's like not too hard to say, okay, this is a metaphor for the economic bloodbath that this class perpetrates all the time. The dirty dealings, the insider trading, all the terrible shit that just wrecks the economy for everybody but them. And, like how many murders have been caused by like a Bain Capital type dude shutting down a factory someplace, and then 4 people go nuts and shoot somebody in a diner. Like there's all this blood on these characters' hands. In some ways, I'm not an anti-business type dude by any stretch, but they're that type of dude, that slicked back hair nightmare guy, is involved in some dirty shit. And they are actually in the real world, like covering for each other. It happens all the time.
Well, I mean, okay, terrible metric, but who is responsible for more horror in the world, a real life Patrick Bateman or Bernie Madoff? Like, I know these are apples and oranges, but like, holy fucking shit. Destroyer of worlds.
Yeah. I mean, Bernie Madoff, people rap about him, like... And the other thing that's interesting about Bernie Madoff is like those characters, not characters, but those type of people, they're going to do that in any environment. I don't know if you know about this story, but apparently he has been like just running shit in prison. Like he figured out this arbitrage scheme where like I guess chocolate milk was really popular and he had enough money to buy all of it. So he bought all the chocolate milk and sat on it until the price went up, and then he sold it off and made money in prison. So it's like it doesn't matter where this dude is operating, he's going to do the same crazy shit. It's just really weird. And yeah.
Okay, so not far from what we're discussing, let's talk about hypersanity. we talk about hypersanity a lot. We're, talking about the Joker. I mean, there are fan theories that, of course, like Bateman, just take away the E, it's Batman. Then he played Batman. So is Patrick Bateman actually Batman, or is he actually the Joker? And Jared Leto, of course, ended up playing the Joker. So actually, Batman kills the Joker in a different way. But anyway, it's a stupid fan theory. It's not worth walking out. But speaking of the Joker as being hyper sane, and is there a way in which a homicidal, ultra capitalist, Wall Street dude is a version of hypersanity? He cracks at the end, but I think all hypersane characters tend to crack in some way. I mean, that defines these hypersane characters.
Well, I wouldn't think that Patrick Bateman is hypersane. Like I wouldn't, and just to define it, in case you haven't heard us talk about this in the past, hypersanity is basically like you see the world so much as it is that your actions upon it appear insane to other people. So it might be like, for instance, imagine there's a time travel movie and there was a kindergarten full of children, and that all those children are going to grow up to cause an apocalypse. And your knowledge of that makes you do something insane. You go in and you shoot all those children, right? And that I mean, obviously, like that's not, you're assuming that you actually have knowledge of the future. So your clear view of the future, your clear view of your surroundings forces you to become insane. You see it in the character that John Goodman plays in 10 Cloverfield Lane. He is kind of insane, but he also knew that some sort of weird alien threat was coming and he planned accordingly. And it's basically like your knowledge of the world as it is. So you see with people on a much lower level, like you just think people are shitty, and so you have a nihilistic attitude and you push people away. And like that's like a very, very low end hypersanity. I think a character like Gordon Gekko is hypersane in a way because he's looking at the markets and he understands that, hey, look, if somebody else isn't going to do all this crazy shit, it's going to get done anyway. Or the character from Wolf of Wall Street is sort of a hypersane character, Jordan Belfort. He looks at these penny stocks, sees the potential in them, and is like, well, someone should be taking advantage of this. I'm going to take advantage of this because I want $50 million in a yacht.
Well, the way I'm jumping from even those examples to Patrick Bateman is that, so it's lore and it seems to be fact that Christian Bale based a lot of his Patrick Bateman character on watching an interview with Tom Cruise. And Tom Cruise and Dianetics is possibly a way of looking at hypersanity.
Yeah.
Right? It's this lens to see the world as it really is. And Tom Cruise is like, he uses that lens better than anybody, maybe, or he's being used by it. But so can we make this jump to this sort of like ultra realism about how the world works and how you might as well manipulate it to your favor if you're that clear on what people's motivations are and how you can get what you want out of the world?
Yeah, well, let's put a pin in Tom Cruise for 1 second because there's a lot to say about Tom Cruise in the context of American Psycho, and just back up a little bit on hyper, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
So the reason why I think that Patrick Bateman isn't a hyper sane character is I think he is simply insane. I think he's a psychopath. Like his method of dealing with the world is untenable. Whereas a hypersane character, like in Batman, Heath Ledger's Joker is hypersane, and he's able to just do all this crazy Rube Goldberg stuff because he's able to see the actual machinery of the world.
But it is tenable because if you're someone who can murder someone, throw them in a duffel bag or into a bag and walk down the street, and people be like, "Hey, where'd you get that bag?" You are seeing how easy it is to commit murder in broad daylight.
But I don't think that has anything to do with the planning of Patrick Bateman. I think I think what Bret Easton Ellis is saying in that particular scene is how shallow the world is.
Sure.
Like, I mean, he's literally dragging a body through a lobby and pulls that out on the street and throws it in the back of a trunk. And his friend, who's the one character that stands out, the gay character, is like, "Oh, where did you get that bag?" I don't think he'd be arguing that the character is hyper sane as much as like he's sort of saying that like how hyper sane the rest of the world is. Like it's actually it's making this like shallow view of the world the primary view.
Right.
And part of that has to do with like hypersanity is all based out of like psychoanalysis. It's out of Lacan. And I think what American Psycho sits in is this period of like liquid modernity. And what that kind of is associated with is, Freud had this idea that there was a point after World War I and World War II where people really asked the fair question is, man, what sort of God allows this kind of thing? So religion starts to crack a little bit. And then the ideas of, Marx, there's Nietzsche, and there's Freud, right? And so these ideas start coming together. And Freud thought like, okay, look, America is going to abandon religion, and it sort of does. But it doesn't quite become atheistic. What it does is it supplants the idea of a higher power with your individual power. So that sort of like self-worship, that self-referential deity gets wrapped up post-World War II in consumerism. And I think Patrick Bateman is this like it's almost like he's the Ubermensch of this particular sort of like self-worshiping consumer drive. And he's like an apex consumer in a weird kind of way. And he's existing almost like a shark. Like these guys are, they always say Wall Street guys are like sharks. And he's like kind of going around in this environment where he has to murder these slightly heavier characters than him. And that to me is just slightly different than and not totally different than hypersanity, but it's just a different motivation that makes a difference.
I don't think the world needs to hear another single solitary word from Ayn Rand, but I would love to read her review of this movie. Well, I would just love to fucking know. I mean, she would hate it because she hates everything, but that's not what I'm interested in. Just her preposterous take.
Well, I think she probably would have. So I think she would have loved a character like Gordon Gekko. Like Gordon Gekko would have been very much in line with like a Howard Rourke or Hank Reardon or whatever the character's name was. I think she would hate Patrick Bateman because he pretends to care. You know what I mean? Like the fact that he has these concerns, the fact that he has these like concerns like for apartheid and all this other stuff. Like she would just be like she would like the character Bryce in the film, who just doesn't give a fuck. And he's like, I'm all about like cocaine and steroids and making money. And I think that would be a very Randian sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know. I can't speak for Ayn Rand.
So let's go back to Tom Cruise. I think that there are two things that this movie and book really reminded me of. One, I'll get to later. The other is before I had even known about that Tom Cruise reference, when watching this movie and reading the book, I really thought it reminded me a lot of Eyes Wide Shut. Mm-hmm. And then I read that reference. I was like, holy shit, it is fucking Tom Cruise.
Yeah. Well, Tom Cruise is mentioned several times in the book. One of the reasons why Patrick Bateman has chosen the place to live where he lives is because Tom Cruise lives there. And I think at one point somebody who's wasted mistakes him for Tom Cruise. I could be totally wrong about it. It's been a while since I read the book. But the two characters that Patrick Bateman venerates are Trump and Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
And it is, to be fair to the novel, it is a different Trump than the Trump we have now. Like it is the Trump of idle irresponsibility, because ultimately Patrick Bateman and the rest of these guys, they don't really do anything. And that's what they're into. We've
seen his calendar. It is just one thing to do per day and a lot of violent doodles.
Yeah, it's just dinner dates and doodles, and which is where I would love to get back to in my life. But, like the Tom Cruise character, it's pretty funny that Christian Bale, rather, based Tom Cruise on it. Like, and I read that, I saw that interview too with him, where it was basically this like weirdly aggressive optimism. And I think, like Scientology is all about becoming hyper sane. Like that's what the whole religion is sort of based on, like being clear, right? Like, like that really famous interview where Tom Cruise is like, when you see an accident, only a Scientologist, only you knows what you're looking at. And it's pretty fucking weird, man.
Yeah.
But also, though, to the knowledge, this is pre-Scientology Tom Cruise that Patrick Bateman is obsessed over. So you wonder, like, okay, what sort of direction could Patrick Bateman taken in his life? Would he have become a Scientologist? I mean, he's so obsessed with personal improvement and personal achievement that if he thought that would help him, who knows? Probably, right?
Yeah. God.
Yeah. it's pretty.
Yeah, I mean that is such a part of this text. This film is thinking about not just what it's critiquing, but what is in synchronicity with it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, speaking of synchronicity, I think there's a lot to be said about, you were mentioning Eyes Wide Shut a second ago, like how similar Patrick Bateman and the character, Tom Cruise's character, who I cannot remember the name of, from Eyes Wide Shut, they solve problems in the same way. They just whip out their bank card, or they whip out their money clip.
Yeah.
You know, they're all very frequently in Eyes Wide Shut, Tom Cruise runs into a problem and then solves it with breaking out some money. And that's done repeatedly in American Psycho. I mean, he's able to get a hooker that he has beaten already back to his house with a big wad of money. And like, talk about like a stupid move, man. That's borderline going down into the basement to see what's going on for that girl, you know?
Yeah. The other thing that this movie really reminded me of is Sex and the City. It might sound like I'm trying to be funny, but the repetition and vacuity and adherence to these style codes, I feel like is very similar in both of them. I'm not a fan of Sex and the City for that very reason. And I think that Sex and the City partially responsible for ruining what was interesting about New York, or cleaning it up, depending on how you want to think about it. But also just it rode that 80s wave of being obsessed with these symbols, this sort of aspirational consumerism, and did it really well. Anyway.
Yeah, I think those obsessions and those symbols, you see it in like a whole bunch of different cultures, right? Like punk rock cultures, like, oh, you know, how cool is your leather jacket? Do you have like the right cut? Like, are you wearing a weird jean jacket that has the right pockets on it or something like that? I think there's like these obsessions that really small subcultures have that give the people who conform to them the most a certain type of power and status. And I mean, that's for sure going on in this. And in a way, it went on in Sex and the City. American Psycho, the film, and Sex and the City, I think, share really well is kind of like a food pornography. I think that's one of the things that's so awesome in this movie. And it's how the film opens, is this restaurant scene, and it really sets up the characters.
Stolen by Dexter very well.
Yeah, totally. Or, I mean, even to a certain extent, the TV series Hannibal. You know, even though Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lamb is supposed to be a gourmand, and that's kind of the whole deal, is he cooked and ate people. He's cannibal. The movie does such a good job of kind of like sending up 80s food culture, and the book is great too. Talking about like having like eagle souffle and like these like raw chicken tartare with squid ink and stuff like that. The language of it is really fun, but like very surface food. And you know, like there's the whole idea of like no one goes there anymore, or people go there, or the constant anxiety over whether or not you can or can't get a resume at Dorsia.
I don't want to spend too much time talking about the book, because I think we're asking people to just see the movie. But I think one of my favorite chapters of any book I've ever read was, it's right near the end of American Psycho, where it must be like 12 pages of he and two guys are on a three-way call deciding where they're going to go to dinner. And it takes them like 4 hours. And one of them has sent their girlfriend to one place, another sent one of their girlfriends to another place. None of them know what's going on. And they end up going, I think, nowhere. Just like 4 hours of trying to decide where to go for dinner. And it's all about status. It's all about what's cool. It's all about who can get us in where, and miscommunication and not knowing who's who or what's going on. And it's just empty. It's just so painfully empty.
Yeah. One of my favorite scenes in the film is when he calls to get an 8 o'clock reservation at Dorsia for that night, and the maitre d' on the other side just starts laughing. And I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary Le Cirque. It's about the real famous restaurant in New York, and it just how similar, or like how that world really was like that. I mean, it was like you think you're getting in here tonight, and it's interesting how restaurateurs and restaurant kitchen people are sort of pirates. You know, and so they have this weird piratical authority over these ultra rich people. Like restaurants have this like kind of strange like they're artists and it's status to go eat there, but it's also nourishing, but not really nourishing. Like you could just eat your egg white omelet or whatever some guy like Patrick Bateman would have. But like the restaurant scenes are just, like the way the food is plated is just so garish and over the top. And I thought it was very well done in the film.
Definitely. So this movie is, I think we haven't necessarily said, I think one of the biggest keys to this movie for me, and especially overcoming any sort of preconceived notion about this movie, is it's hilarious.
Yeah.
I think it's fucking really funny. And for a movie, compared to Office Space, like Office Space, you laugh out loud. It's absurd. But American Psycho is not that different in what it's parodying in certain ways and the way it's parodying it in certain ways. It being a parody, or no, parody is probably not the right word. There's probably a much better word for what
it's a black comedy is how most people describe it.
Definitely a black comedy. Wait,
satire might be.
Satire is a better word. Thank you. Yeah. It's a satire. And so, as satires do, it has a message. So my question for you is, it's left at the end vague as to whether or not this is all in his head or all real or maybe partly both, whatever. Do you think that it undermines the satire if it turns out that it's a Jacob's Ladder scenario or it's just all, and then I woke up? It obviously undermines the narrative and what we've seen.
Yeah.
And I think this is an interesting thing that we talked a little bit about before we got rolling is when you're reading a book, the unreliable narrator is a thing. Like someone is giving you first person narration. But that's different. It's weird in film because you are seeing it. Maybe there's narration, and so you can sort of go like, oh, the narrator is the person whose eyes I am seeing this all through, but you don't see it through their eyes. You see them in these scenes too. And so when a film has this possible unreliable narrator situation, it's a little trickier. It's harder to sort of like see both sides because you're seeing it as it potentially really is.
Yeah, I think this is a bit, like, I think the director, she did a really great job with this film. I think it's a fun-looking film. It's interesting that she says she didn't have final cut of it, which is, I'm curious. She mentioned that in that Charlie Rose interview. She's like, I didn't have final cut of this film, but it's the film that would have been my final cut, which is weird. It's like that Zizekian thing about like, coffee without cream in a place that doesn't have cream.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of what's going on is that this is an area where the film fails a little bit visually. And Bret Easton Ellis makes this point that when you have an unreliable narrator with a privileged perspective, which is Patrick Bateman, he's narrating it. You're getting it from his perspective. When you're dealing with a visual medium, it's very difficult to play that Jacob's Ladder game if you're coming from that perspective, because what's going on in there is like, why would the unreliable narrator's perspective be called into question? There's no need for it to be called into question because he's unreliable, it's already a thing. Like you could have just had him do all that mayhem and then just sort of get away with it at the end, and it would have the same effect than introducing a plot element that called it into question. Does that make sense?
Almost.
Yeah. I mean,
are you saying that if it's totally in his head? Well, I mean, in the film, he does start to break. And so that could be he's not able to maintain his lie.
Right.
So like if someone's over dinner telling you a story and it's a lie and they start to get tripped up, you see through it. As an unreliable narrator, you start to see through it. And if we can think of a film as being that, like they're not intentionally giving you the part that shows their hand, but
yeah, I think what I mean by like the visual element failing here is, for instance, back to Clockwork Orange, like Stanley Kubrick does all these tricks to sort of make Alex's perspective feel more realistic. Like he uses these wide angle camera shots, and so Alex is usually in the center of them, and the rest of the film it's all weird and wide and distorted on the sides. And then when the camera is pointed directly at him, when it's from another perspective, he's in a clear focus in a normal lens. And so what it does is it builds up this sort of like visual language where he is the narrator, he might be unreliable, but you trust his perspective. And you can never really trust Patrick Bateman's perspective because the film hasn't really answered the question of whether or not you're supposed to it hasn't subtly answered the question if you're supposed to be identifying with him or not. And for me, all of his murders up until the chainsaw scene where he drops the chainsaw from the roof or whatever, or from the stairwell rather, all that seems sort of like credible to a movie of this type. And then after that, it just goes nuts. And I think that, Bret Easton Ellis does this in quite a few of his books or stories where the thing is happening and it just gets super hyped up and absurd at the end. Like Lunar Park is kind of the same, right? It's basically about Bret Easton Ellis and his relationship with his fiction and his father and Patrick Bateman as a character. And it goes along pretty normal until near the end of it. Like Patrick Bateman sort of comes to life in his real world. And it works in a book because your brain is making a lot of those connections. Whereas like when you're shown the thing in a film, it's like, well, he was there. He wasn't there. The car blew up when he shot bullets at it. That is absurd. But I just saw it happen. So you have to take it for face value in a weird way.
Yeah. But although there is one scene, there's one thing in the film, there's only one moment that he is not present for, which is when Jean, his secretary, is looking through his day planner and just sees all the basically emptiness and then the really violent doodles, which doesn't give us any clues necessarily because it is either that's how fucked up he is and this is him sort of planning out the violence that he's perpetrating, or it's just like, yeah, this is all his fantasy. This is like the movie is an illustration of his doodles. Right? Yeah. But that is the only thing we see that isn't through his eyes.
Yeah, and it's weird that it's seen through the most, I guess she's sort of the most sympathetic character in the film.
She's the only one we really spend time with who's not in the game.
Right, and then it's
she probably wants to be, but she's clearly not in it.
Well, she clearly wants to be. Like, he invites her over, she comes over to his house, she's ready to rock, and then she even sort of gives him an opening to come at her even more. She's like, well, I'm always involved with, men that I shouldn't be involved with. And he's like, I think I'll hurt you. And she's like, well, I don't really want to be hurt. And she's like, but do you want me to stay? And so she's a character who is almost, I don't want to say like asking for it's not the right thing, but she's like almost like offering herself to him. And she has like, maybe even, she definitely doesn't know that he's a psycho, but she probably has an idea that he's not doing anything, 'cause she sits right next to him. So she has to have some idea that he is an empty person a little bit, just because she books his schedule. She knows what he's doing. He's not going to actual business meetings. He's only going to things. So she has this view into him. But I don't love this. I like the humor of her, like looking through the scene and seeing all these things of murder. But I think that it does something weird to the perspective of the film that she has discovered it. It's off somehow.
Yeah, it's the RZ reader, right? It's the one thing in the film that doesn't belong with the rest somehow.
Yeah, and it's like she would, in the 80s, it'd probably be a different story, but she would have been somehow like disturbed by that. I think like you couldn't keep working for that guy, or maybe you would, I don't know, like people work with Matt Lauer, right? But yeah, I don't know. It's just weird. Like I don't find the questioning about like whether or not he was or wasn't a murderer very interesting at all.
Yeah.
I think I could just care less. To me, it's more about how did he get to that point of even imagining it, or how did the society around him produce something like him?
Yeah. Although, produce something like him if he's not actually a killer. The thing is, though, maybe I shouldn't ask this question while tape is rolling, but I have thoughts that are that violent.
Everyone does.
So if none of the violence is, quote, real, if it's all just in his mind, him cracking up is unique. Him having those thoughts is not.
Right.
In which case, Actually, one question I do have, and I again, I don't want to rely so much on the book, but speaking about the movie, the book is infinitely more violent than the movie, and that was by design by the director, who didn't want it to be rely on violence or necessarily even a commentary on violence, but rather a commentary on status and vacuity in the 80s and capitalism. I think that there's no way that movie could have at the time been nearly as violent as the book. And I don't think it could now. Even in an era when we have something like Human Centipede and Saw and things like that, I still don't know that a movie could be made at any budget with any funding that is as graphically violent as that book.
Well,
and and maybe that's slightly arguable, but what does it mean? Okay, so the director made a choice not to make it all about the violence. And so the violence was played down. In fact, it's funny, Texas Chainsaw Massacre comes up twice in the movie, but it's also very much like Texas Chainsaw Massacre because Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's a horrifying film, but you don't see that much violence. You don't see a chainsaw split someone in half in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You see blood splattering. You see someone get hit on the head. But there's not a lot of graphic violence in that movie, but it's really fucked up. And the movie American Psycho, it's about this raging psychopath, but you don't see that much violence. You see bodies, but they're not even that maimed or anything.
Well, I think the director made a very smart choice. If you want to really get across the point that this movie is about, a critique of yuppie culture, putting the emphasis on things like the insanely plated foods and the costuming and how everybody kind of looks the same, and then the famous business card scene where it's like, it's like, oh, how did you suddenly get all this taste? And it's like, oh my God, there's raised letterpressing on it or whatever. All that stuff is more enjoyable because you think about a film that I think is as graphic as the movie or as the book rather is Antichrist. Right, that has some pretty graphic.
No,
is it not Antichrist? Which is the one that has the really terrible genital mutilation scene?
Yeah, Antichrist.
Yeah, but that
and the calf destruction and
that stuff is.
That's a slice of what's in the book, though.
Yeah, but it's like anything. You're not going to be fucking Lord of the Rings. You don't really get the full scale of the battle. Of
course, but I guess I'm intrigued to think about 400 pages into a 2-hour movie. Everything's got to go, including the amount of violence. But movie violence and written violence are two very different things. And what would it be like for this movie to have taken the violence as far as the book does?
Yeah.
You know what? I'm not even going to say the horrible things that happen. I was almost going to go to the worst part of the book.
Yeah.
And it's not even worth saying, but I think that would do something in a film. I don't know.
Well, it makes that stuff would be so strong that you wouldn't be able to talk about the other stuff. You wouldn't be able to discuss holy shit, that card scene is really funny, or the scene where he berates the laundromat lady with his sheets that may or may not be covered in blood. Those scenes that are just comical and
which is kind of what ended up happening with the book with people who didn't appreciate it. They went straight for the most violent parts, as opposed to to my mind in the movie, the prostitute's leg in the air while he's flexing his muscles in the mirror is one of the funniest fucking things I've ever seen.
Oh, it's so funny.
And
just don't look at it, eat it. It's so funny. That line is hilarious.
Oh God, that movie's so dark.
The darkest scene to me though is the scene with the homeless man.
Sure.
And I think that is you get the echoes of the book at its most in that scene, and it's kind of a weird scene. It's the scene that everybody hates because the dog gets killed, right? Everybody who doesn't like.
Oh, really?
Movie, yeah, a lot of people are like,
to me, it's black guy gets killed first,
right? But that's what's so crazy about that is a lot of people. The dog is what bothers them. It's not that he knifes the homeless man to death, but you're oh man, when he steps on the dog and it whimpers or whatever. It's pretty rare to have a dog die in a movie. I think it's way rarer than having humans die. And that scene is now that when a person was looking for a way to distinguish themselves from their friends, they might actually help a homeless guy out and get some fucking Facebook cred or something like that. But he, absent the ability to get likes on Facebook, murders this guy or whatever. I don't know about that. But that scene is pretty dark. And I think that the dog really sort of makes you, for a moment, sympathize with his victims a little bit more. Because later on, his fiance shows up with a pet of her own, and it's a pig, and I think the symbolism there is pretty strong. Like they're like pigs of the trough at this event, and this weird animal that's off-putting to him, and he just further shows that he doesn't care about any living thing, which is different than Alex from Clockwork Orange, who has the pet snake. So he actually is able to care for something, and Patrick Bateman cares for nothing but himself.
Yeah.
And then another scene that is absolutely hilarious is, like, if you were looking for evidence of him having hallucinations, it's when the ATM machine says, "Feed me the cat."
Yeah.
And he's like about to feed the cat to the ATM machine. And then the lady's like, "Don't do that." And he like shoots her, and you don't give a shit about that lady. And that's really the moment where it just totally kicks off into crazy land. I mean, he shoots probably like 40 bullets from this 10-round magazine, causing a cop car to explode. Yeah, it's pretty hilarious at that point. And to me, that has a little bit of a feeling of like what else was going on in the 80s, action movies, so there's a little bit of that going on.
Yeah. What I also really appreciate about this movie is, despite the fact that he gets crazier and it amps up to a degree, and you get these frayed moments at the end, in a sense, this movie doesn't have an arc. You know what I mean? Like, let's think about it like a typical horror movie for a second. Think about it like a slasher movie. There's no final girl. There's no redemption. It's not a police procedural. He's not that much more broken up at the end than in the beginning. It's just that you see the edges fraying a little more. Like, he just has a rampage, but it's not like the plot is developing and developing and developing, and it climaxes with this shootout or something like that. It's just it's just a little more action heavy towards the end. And so this movie, we're just sort of immersed in this state.
Right.
You're just sort of stuck with this asshole for 2 hours.
Yeah, and I think that goes right into, at the very end when he's sitting at the table with these 4 other guys and they're watching Reagan. Over his shoulder, you can see the words, "This is not an exit."
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of online conversation about how that's just a reference to Sartre's No Exit.
Yeah.
And so at the very end, these people are unwilling to leave this. And it is very existential in the way that nothing really happens, and you're supposed to, I guess, sit with the idea that this character has either done nothing or gotten away with it.
Yeah.
And both are sort of unsatisfying to you. And in some ways, like, having gotten away with it would be more satisfying than having nothing happen and having no resolvement of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the first conversation is as vacuous as the last conversation.
Yeah. There's a lot of like set exposition, not even exposition, but there's a lot of like interesting things going on with the sets. Particularly Paul Allen's apartment is very interesting, because when the girl is running through the rooms, there's one point where for like half a second, maybe even a quarter of a second, you can see finger marks at the doors, and it's really disturbing. It's super gross. You're
I didn't see that.
Oh man, like they're there. And then when he comes back to the apartment, it's all clean and super done really well. He backs out through a red door, which is like, red doors are pretty loaded with symbolism. On one level, it's like it's the 80s, so everybody was obsessed with feng shui, and it was sort of a mid-century modern / feng shui thing. But it meant luck, and sometimes that you would like luck in the context of this is maybe he got away with it. And getting back into like Freud stuff, like when you dream about a red door, it symbolizes that you're keeping your passions kempt up. So it's kind of interesting to have this red door at a moment where he may have had this whole dream sequence. So does the red door say that he is actually keeping his passions completely kempt up? Maybe it's like a clue to what happened.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely very magnified, considering all the interiors of these domestic spaces are white, and black. You've got the white cloud-like bedroom, those Robert Longo paintings, the sort of like contorted body images, just black on white. It's very sort of polarized. The light and dark, these sort of empty spaces that feel like a non-space. They feel like the non-space of heaven or something like that.
Yeah.
but they're sort of filled with nothing.
Yeah. I feel like this film has really benefited from the nostalgic resurgence. I don't know that people would have cared about this film or maybe it's also a thing like their cycles, so it comes back. It feels like this movie lately has had a bit of more juice behind it than it did, say, in the mid 2000s.
Yeah. I mean, one thing it does for its time, I think really works, is something that right now is making me more angry about contemporary film than even CGI, which in American Psycho, the soundtrack is often just slammed in. This sort of like this 80s classic will just, like Walking on Sunshine, you are just hit with that song and it sets the mood. It's obviously irony, or he's forcing it upon himself, however you want to read that. But it's sort of like you are forced to confront that song, that mood, the obviousness of the lyrics and its evocation. And I think it's really adept at doing that throughout the movie.
Yeah.
But that is now the most unrelenting trope in everything.
In Stranger Things second season, I just started watching it.
Yeah.
I think the second season is terrible.
Whoa.
I mean, I'm going to go out. I mean, I'm only a few episodes into it, but I don't want to say terrible. It's very fan servicey, I guess might be a better way of saying it. Like, it's like, if you like season 1, you're going to love season 2.
Sure.
And I think it does this really obvious thing with music that is...
which is a bummer because the score of season 2 I really like.
Yeah.
But the soundtrack is, and I think the most egregious example I've seen recently is Baby Driver, which I think is one of the worst movies I've ever seen. But what it is especially guilty of is just letting classic rock and pop do the work that the film should do.
Right. Well, I think like
just throwing out like a song that we all know because it's a cultural touchstone, and using it in the most unimaginative way to force the mood in a way that has nostalgia propping it up at the same time. And it's so tired. We've been at this for so fucking long, and we're still throwing outrageous money at licensing for these crap back catalog songs or great back catalog songs to do the work in a film that is pure laziness like CGI.
Yeah, it's complicated too because there's a certain total pleasure in it. I mean, would Thor Ragnarok's trailer's been as fucking epic and badass without Immigrant Song? I mean, there's like just perfect when you see like hear like Hammer of the Gods and like there's all this like crazy Marvel shit going on. Totally successful. And then even though I'm very critical of weaponized nostalgia, it's going on there. And then I really like, I will probably eventually have to do an episode about season 2 of Stranger Things, like way after the fact. But I mean, I just found like, for instance, the scene where the character Max is introduced, the song that's playing when you first see her and the guy in the Trans Am, it's so hacky feeling.
Yes.
It's really not good.
Yes.
But I think that is not what was going on in Baby Driver. And I think Baby Driver, it's only about that. Like, I think Baby Driver is a fun movie and it's very shallow. And I think it's also, I don't know if we talked about this on a podcast already, but the idea that the dude in the pickup truck that has the shootout with Baby Driver is the actual hero of the film, and then everyone else is terrible. Was it?
Yeah,
it was talking about
that was us.
Yeah. I mean,
and I totally agree. Yeah, that was the only thing I liked about that movie is that maybe that character had a redeeming quality.
Yeah, like that guy's like the Punisher in that film.
He really is.
But I think Baby Driver isn't trying to do anything other than hit you with this fun soundtrack and like link it up.
Sure.
It's more.
And I object the same way I object to Hostess creating shitty food in every convenience store.
Yeah. See, I actually remember quite liking Baby Driver.
I'm the only one.
Yeah.
No one agrees with me.
I mean, to me, like if you look at Edgar Wright's the Mighty Boosh guy is in this music video that he did, and it's basically like a little like 4-minute music video, and it's a bank robbery, and it's kind of set to the song of the whatever band it is. And I just think of Baby Driver as like an hour and a half version of that. And it's not to me like a narrative masterpiece or anything like that. And I think Jamie Foxx is particularly good in it. I don't know why. That's that character I really liked. But that's not really what's going on in American Psycho as
No,
much.
it's not.
Like not at all. And then
Well, that template was not so used and abused yet.
Yeah.
You know, it was kind of it's not like I'm saying like pop music had never been used that way in a motion picture before, but that sort of like slamming you with that kind of nostalgia was not territory that had been driven into the ground quite yet. And so watching it in American Psycho, I thought was quite interesting because it feels just off somehow.
Well, one of the things about it is like when American Psycho was made, those songs weren't cool again.
Right.
Like they were actually off-putting. Like when you hear like Walking on Sunshine, you're like, oh, that song fucking eats a dick.
Yeah.
And it's the way it's portrayed in the film, it's actually making you not like Patrick Bateman. It'd be like if the whole soundtrack was just like, to do it now, he would be listening to like
Do You Believe
Nickelback
by
and Celine Dion.
Do You Believe by Cher? Just like
Yeah.
that. It's just in that in between where it's not funny yet.
Yeah, it
just
hasn't
sucks.
come around. But now, like those songs, enough time has passed with the film where there's like, you're like, oh, of course Patrick Bateman likes that shit. And it's interesting, like the cultural echoes of Patrick Bateman too. I had to watch the first 2 seasons of Keeping Up with the Kardashians because my wife was like super obsessed with it at the time.
I think had to is an exaggeration.
No, it was on, and I lived in a studio apartment with her, and it was fucking blaring on our TV that was too big for our space. It was awful, and we got into some near divorce level fights over it. It is one of the most irritating things she's ever done to me, is have that shit on all the time. Anyway, not bitter
It's a
about
good
it
thing
at all.
she doesn't listen
She
to
doesn't
this
care about this podcast at all. But like but a lot of people were really obsessed with watching that show because it was so weird. But one of the characters, I guess characters would be a good word, is the boyfriend of one of them, Scott Disick, was obsessed with Patrick Bateman and his clothing style. Like he adopted this like crazy yuppie clothing style that's very Patrick Bateman inspired. And in fact, he went as Patrick Bateman on a Halloween episode of the costume. His costume on a Halloween episode was Patrick Bateman, and he looked perfect in it, and now you're seeing that exact same costume again with like Trump's kids, and it's non-ironic. So I'm curious, like how,
So upsetting.
like, I'm curious how like the Trump regime will affect people's view of Patrick Bateman as a character. Like when you're like, okay, well, it's obviously really bad to be I'm not going to say it's really bad to be, but there's a particular type of personality that just loves Trump, and Patrick Bateman loved Trump in the 90s. So are people going to think that Patrick Bateman is less cool because of that? I would say yes.
I don't know. I mean, this is one of those things that I try not to think about too much because I start to lose sleep if I dwell. But the way in which too many people become obsessed with horrible, hideous people, and perhaps that fascination is not too distinct from celebration. That investment, the line between being invested in something in a prurient way is not always so very far from being an aspirational way.
I mean, you really see it in hip hop right now, where like you have like gang members, and and they have the same thing, like symbols of status and wealth, like jewels, fancy cars, hot girls, but especially kind of more of like your like Chirac type dudes, like there's this adoration of violence along with that, and the idea is that if you're like this hyper masculine character, you can achieve these things, and you see it in there's a type of music in Mexico that it's called narcorrido music. It's basically like Mexican music that glorifies the cartels. And I bet in every culture they have it. It seems like, in Ireland, there's like sort of this like interest in like Irish gangsters. Like right now, Conor McGregor is allegedly in some feud with the Irish mob over some bar fight or something like that. And people are like, oh, you better watch out. And so it seems like there's this kind of underworld. But it's different for Patrick Bateman because yuppies are not the underworld. Like, it sort of makes sense that like gangster characters are interesting because they're sort of against modernity. They're sort of against the modern society. Like, people love pirates. You know, there's like Talk Like a Pirate Day. People love Straight Outta Compton. People love
Johnny Cash.
Johnny Cash. You know, Johnny Cash is a perfect example where you have these underworld characters, but they're always sort of redeemed. Right? Like in gangster, you know, like there's, you know, Lil Wayne has fear God on his eyes, tattooed on his eyelids. Like, so there's this idea that there's going to be some sort of eventual redemption. You know, for instance, Bushwick Bill from the Ghetto Boys, he went all Jesus-y. You know, like people are waiting for that moment, but you don't get that with Patrick Bateman.
Yeah, I mean, and at the same time, you know, our next episode is about black metal, which is an entire genre of music that is focused on just darkness and nihilism, satanic refutation and refusal of all that is good. And there is zero redemption. There is no traditional narrative arc in black metal like that, like Patrick Bateman.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, you know, Patrick Bateman's lifestyle becomes like this ultimate nihilism. But it's also inside this aspiration, which makes it really tricky, right? Like, and his whole thing is like, it's the outside that counts. He says that a couple times, I think, in the film. It's like, he basically says like, I want to fit in. It's the outside that matters. And, you know, whereas black metal sort of rejects it. It's like, you know, where's black on the outside? Because it's black on the inside, like the Morrissey song. Like, in that, even though it's probably supposed to be more evil, isn't as off-putting is, again, there's just something about something that's supposed to be clean on the outside that is dark on the inside. And I think that has a lot to do with today's like sex scandal thing. Like, every time some NPR guy gets caught, you're almost more horrified by the, you know, the sweet, allegedly sweet people who are getting caught than, you know, if a character like Dan Bilzerian Dan Bilzerian, he's like this guy, he's a famous poker player. He's got like $200 million, and his Instagram is just nothing but machine guns, jet skis, and boob jobs. He's got like a crazy beard. Anyway, he's like just a rich dirtbag guy, and he's living this crazy, fun, like Maxim lifestyle. And if you found out that he had like put something in somebody's drink, you'd be like, okay, whatever. But I mean, you would be mad, but you would not be.
You wouldn't be surprised.
You wouldn't be surprised, and there wouldn't be this feeling of betrayal. And that betrayal is, I think, more terrifying but at the same time, like, can Patrick Bateman betray? Because you're supposed to hate what he represents, and then what he actually is bad too. So I don't know. Maybe it's not the same as like Bill Cosby or something like that.
Yeah. Oh God.
I don't know. What do you think about the idea that this film was originally supposed to have Oliver Stone directing and Leonardo DiCaprio in the lead?
So glad that didn't happen.
Yeah.
First of all, Leonardo DiCaprio is not interchangeable with other people. Well, actually, the biggest thing for me when thinking about that, I don't want to overdetermine what this film was because it was directed by a woman and the screenplay the adaptation was by a woman. Okay, the gaze, which we normally think of as the male gaze. And cinema is in many ways a history of a manifestation of the male gaze through technology. In the hands of a woman director and a woman screenwriter, American Psycho became something else. Can't quantify necessarily. I don't want to make too many assumptions, but it is worth thinking about all these scenes of his morning routines, of yoga, and his balls are just like the absolute center of the frame.
Balls yoga.
Is that a thing?
No, probably is. I don't know.
Now it is.
Now it is.
You know, even when he's having sex and the way he's sort of, his gaze is turned against himself, but at the same time, like, even though he's shallow and disgusting and all that, like, he looks so hot. Like, through this movie, he really does. Except when he's, like, at lunch with a bunch of douchebags and he just looks like a smarmy cunt. When he's, like, at home caring for his body, it's super sexy. And I, again, don't want to over-assume, but I really do connect that to the fact that it was directed by a woman
Well,
who would have taken a different sort of care with what that would be, what that would look like.
Well, I don't know if you noticed this, but like in a lot of horror movies, the victims are insanely hot, like Playboy 10 hot sometimes. And the women victims in this movie are not like conventionally like horror movie.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to say they're not attractive. Like I think Close Feeney is like one of the most I think there's just something about her that is attractive, but without her style and her vibe, no. Like if you're talking about just like Playboy magazine standards, I'm not trying to, I'm just using that as
but that's what this movie is. Like if you look at the food, you look at the interior design, you look at the suits, but then the women, the choice of actresses does not match.
Yeah. They're more like indie film girls.
Yep.
And I think they're all attractive, but they're not like the same level of like plastic attractiveness that like even Jared Leto and Patrick Bateman are in this film. Which is an interesting choice. I mean, it's a lot to be said about that. Like, was that the choice of the female director? I mean,
actually, to my mind, and obviously it's a taste thing, but like the screenwriters in the film, I forget her character's name, she's kind of the most traditionally attractive woman in the entire film. But she's actually also the screenwriter. She wasn't someone they just grabbed out of casting because she was like looked hot in her 8x10.
Yeah, the one exception to this is somebody who I had even forgotten was in the film. Reese Witherspoon is undeniably attractive.
Oh yeah, but she is quirky. She is not a like penthouse centerfold. Again, if these characters were real, they would only concern themselves with models.
Yeah, you expect it to be more of like an Ivanka Trump type, like
that's
Russian.
what I'm thinking.
Yeah, that's.
Yes.
I mean, I think even like kind of like describing it as like not conventionally attractive isn't quite getting at what I'm trying to say. Is like you expect like Russian model hot for Patrick Bateman's obsessions.
Yes,
and the women in this film are not Russian model hot.
Yeah, they're actually interesting actors.
Yeah, they're just normal. Yeah, they're like indie. They're indie film hot.
Yeah.
Which I guess is technically sort of an indie film. Lionsgate put it out for not too much money. I mean, I don't know.
Right. It was interesting hearing Reese Witherspoon wanting to be in this movie and felt that it was this sort of like feminist move on her part, despite what was surrounding Easton Ellis in that book.
Yeah, I didn't run across anything about her. Like I might not have just looked in the right spots, but it was like I was so surprised to see her on the screen because I really like her as an actress.
She's great.
Just Legally Blonde, I think is a fucking great movie. I mean, it's just great, right? Like, and I really liked her.
What was the hiking movie?
Wild?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I love Cheryl Strayed's books. I think they're phenomenal. I love her. Actually, like the advice column I wrote for a while was totally because of Cheryl Strayed's
really?
Dear Sugar. Yeah, I was so inspired by Dear Sugar that I wrote that. The one thing I wanted to talk about was in 2000, the obsession with a morning routine like that seemed crazy. But now my morning routine isn't so different than that.
Is that because of your age, or do you think it's a time, or do you think it's 2017?
I think it's 2017 because you think about what I was really thinking about is how.
Are we going to talk about Tim Ferriss again?
We were about to talk about Tim Ferriss. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about.
My favorite subject.
Your favorite subject. But you think about in the book, he has Art of the Deal on his table. You know, he's obsessed with Trump, and so this is aspirational sort of deal. You know, like this sort of lifestyle obsession has been kind of mainstreamed quite a bit. I mean, any men's fitness magazine reads like a How to Be Patrick Bateman. It's all about like how to pick up women, what clothes to wear, how to not look old, you know, how to be more fit. And one of the things about it, I think this modern obsession with that stuff is so similar to Patrick Bateman in American Psycho because ultimately where does it lead? It leads nowhere. There's, you know, you have to bolt that sort of behavior onto something else in order for it to be, I think, moral's not the right word, but useful perhaps.
Well, it's just like the practice of magic and manipulation is that if you are using it towards some sort of ends, that's very different than just practicing magic for its own sake. You're eating your own tail.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to invoke the traditional anxiety against rhetoric, though, for that. You know, it's very similar to like our Death Note conversation. It's like, okay, you can do a thing that leads some people to darkness. It's probably going to lead you to darkness. So I wonder if this sort of aspirational self-obsession that involves like constant improvement, I mean, does it ultimately lead you into a Patrick Bateman direction? I guess I'm trying to get to a point about like, when does self-improvement not be narcissism? You know,
Oh, totally.
like
It is narcissism. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, you and I feel very strongly that yoga is a damn good thing to do, but yoga, I think, as wonderful as it is an excuse for most people to just sort of be selfish.
I've met the most narcissistic people I've ever met in yoga.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty crazy. And I found that like when I'm doing it a lot, I actually had this conversation with a friend of mine the other night, is that I find myself, one of the reasons why I stopped doing yoga again is I find myself getting like I think too much about myself. I'm thinking about like what's going on in my mind and even like what's going on with my body. And I get sort of depressed the more yoga I do. It has like sort of the opposite effect that I think it's supposed to have on other people.
Well, I mean, this is similar to a conversation I was having with someone today. I was talking about how I'm training jiu-jitsu, and he had been training in Muay Thai for a long time. And we were having the conversation of that expression, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when you're training in fighting, it's really hard. I mean, I've gone from being sort of like I think I've said this on this podcast before, but like, I'm a Canadian liberal dude. Like, I'm an artist. I get to live in this world as if violence doesn't exist. It's this privilege that I've walked around with my whole life. And I've been very cognizant of the fact that since I've been training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that I now walk down the street and wonder if I can take dudes. It's like the exact opposite of how I've walked through the world. And holy shit, how did we get to this?
We were talking about self-improvement.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that
And
like,
it can be damaging, basically.
right. And it's sort of like, you train for violence? Well, you start thinking about violence. Duh. Like, of course that's what's going to happen. And so like, yoga has done amazing things for my body. Meditation has done amazing things for my mind. But at the same time, yeah, that's narcissistic. That is what it is. And so, well, what are you doing with that? Are you trying to calm your mind to be able to do something else? Are you trying to tone your body to go forth in the world with more comfort, with more strength, with more dignity? Are you training in jiu-jitsu to protect your family or whatever? Is there an end to these means? Just like studying semiotics or deconstruction or all that. Like, these are just tools. And if you're not using them, you're just obsessed with tools. And that's actually pretty mundane.
Yeah. I find like the higher ends of pursuits, and I imagine that if I was like really accomplished with yoga, I would probably feel the same as if I was really accomplished with jiu-jitsu. At a certain point, you can't really focus on yourself. You have to focus on what you're doing and the techniques and things that you're learning. And over time, these practices like transform yourself. And I think something like yoga or jiu-jitsu or even like just old school bodybuilding, it's so like in a way codified. It's like Aleister Crowley's magic. You know, it's change and conformity with will. You're exacting your will. And jiu-jitsu is a particularly interesting one because I found, you know, one of the reasons why I've planned to return training is like there's two reasons. One is it's always something I felt like I should have pursued more, and it's more of a mental thing for me. Like, can I force myself to do this despite my aging decrepitude? You know, what can I achieve at this age? And the other one is like every single day on BART, I see some crazy shit happen, and I just, you know, I'm a kind of person who would want to stop someone like grabbing some girl or something like that. And I need to know that I can do it again, you know. I mean, just imagine how like all those train videos where you see some dude like there's the one the other day on BART, like that older man, like just berating and like pushing that, you know, like that smaller Asian dude. You're like, man, does not one person on this train know a rear naked choke? I mean, that basically solves the problem right there. And then the other thing that people do is like they get in between. They're like, hey, man, it's not worth it. It's not. Just put the person out. Just put them out. Take the zip tie that you should have with you out of your bag. And you don't have zip ties in your bag? Really?
I might have an energy bar. That's all I have to offer the situation.
Man,
Hey, man, share the energy bar.
We're
all friends here.
I am overarmed for the Bay Area, that is for sure. Or maybe not armed enough, depending on your perspective. What do you think? Do you think that Patrick Bateman is the most stylish murderer?
Oh. Well, style according to GQ, probably, but like Hannibal Lecter, you watch him walk off into the sunset. He's just got this panache, and he's super pretentious, but he had a lot of style.
Hannibal Lecter has real style. Patrick Bateman has new money style.
Yeah.
You're totally right. When Lecter is walking off in the sunset in his Panama Jack outfit, just cool. Totally cool. And I haven't watched the TV series at all, but I understand it's also very cool.
It's pretty stylish. Nobody likes new money.
Although Patrick Bateman is supposed to be kind of old money, right? Like
It's true. His father owns
the company, which is something that's not really talked about in the movie, but it's just dropped in there.
Yeah.
If you had to adopt the clothing style of any horror movie villain, whose style would you adopt?
It depends why I'm adopting it. Is it just like, I am Mark Kate and I'm going to start dressing like this one murderer?
Yeah, like you're going to be like...
Or am I going to be a murderer?
No, your fall look is inspired by.
Oh, okay. Because like we just did Trick or Treat and Sam looks rad. Like if I was a murderer, I would want to walk around in a onesie.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Fudge. If I genuinely did not give a shit about what anybody thought of me and just dressed for me.
Pinhead?
No, I was going to say like any vampire. Any vampire who hasn't like left the 16th century. Just like goth asshole.
But like the characters in What We Do. What was the movie, the vampire movie, the comedy one?
What We Do in the Shadows.
What We Do in the Shadows.
Oh, God.
That movie, we should cover that.
We should cover that.
That movie...
That is a damn funny movie.
It's great. It's the best in show of vampires.
Oh, my God.
It is just such a phenomenal movie. For me, honestly, as much as I kind of had problems with it, I love the style of the character that ends up being like the actual villain of The Punisher. Like, I love the idea of going from like the Gucci tactical to like super crazy 3-piece suits. I think that character has like a really good style.
That's true. When he is business, he's dressed for business, and when he's business, he's dressed for business.
Yeah,
that's
like that.
True.
The idea of like tailored tactical gear, I think, is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's good.
It's douchey, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
Like black digital camo for no reason. I mean, it's...
All right. Let's fade to black and roll the credits. Subscribe, rate on iTunes and Stitcher. Join our mailing list. We'll see you next time for Black Metal, and between now and then, listen to some Mayhem and some Dark Throne and some Satyricon and some Immortal and some Wolves in the Throne Room and some Liturgy and
Ludicra, if you want to keep it Bay Area.
Amazing.
Is that a Bay Area band?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Check you later.
To see Jason Bateman like,
Patrick Bateman.
What'd I say?
Jason Bateman.
Who's that?
He's an actor.